Dr. Adrian Harrison. He's going to speak to you on his topic. I'll let him talk about him and what he's done. He's traveled a long way to get here, so I'm sure you're going to enjoy him. He came highly recommended to us, so give him your attention and we'll go from there, okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for arranging this conference and giving me this opportunity to talk about acoustic myography. And I know you're all sat there thinking, what on earth is acoustic myography? Well, bear with me for just a few minutes. A long time ago, I started working with muscle, probably more than 30 years ago, skeletal muscle. And I had issues right from the start because I wanted to measure muscle whilst it was dynamic, whilst it was actually moving and contracting. And I had problems. And I ended up using surface electromyography as the sort of gold standard, but it always gave me issues. I got results, of course, but there were always issues with recordings and analyses. And it took me a while to try and figure out how to do something that was more relevant, something that was better. And the answer came via the British Museum and the Etruscans and their collection, and oysters in Portugal, but that's another story and I'll talk about that later. What I ended up with is acoustic myography, and we've ended up making the units really small. If you want to come and have a look at these units, they're very quick and easy to use and activate. We're on booth 213, and you can come and have a look and get a demonstration and talk to us about them. So, acoustic myography, what exactly is it and how can we use it? If we start off with some of the important issues, what is the practice gap? Well, I would argue that there is currently no precise routine assessment of muscle function. What we have is really bound with issues. And if we want to look at balance and strength and performance in athletes, we want something that is quick and easy, but accurate to use. The objectives then of this very short lecture is to try and teach you something about the precision of this dynamic technique of acoustic myography, to give you some sort of understanding of the parameters that are essential for the functioning of this technique, and to give you some sort of ongoing information, because there's quite a bit of information available in terms of published research in this field. The clinical bottom line is that acoustic myography looks to be a very promising tool that offers an insight into improvement in actual physical performance measurement, something that you can apply very quickly, use very accurately, and it's relatively simple to analyze. The type of areas that you might want to use acoustic myography for could, for example, be the recruitment of individuals. You want to recruit somebody new into your team, you need to have some sort of idea of what performance level are they at. What level of coordination, because that often gives rise to issues later on. And then what are their future potential? How are you going to train them and refine them so that they achieve their true potential? Unfortunately, accidents happen and you need to rehabilitate individuals. And again, you can use acoustic myography in this field to follow the progress of your training program and eventually to decide whether they have recovered. Are they fully recovered, fully healed from their injury, or is there some sort of compensation issue that you need to deal with? Balance issue, for example. We know from recent work, from the work of Myers and his colleague Thomas Myers, that muscles are no longer identified as individual units. We now know that they are interconnected, a myofascial kinetic chain. And this leads to a lot of problems, but it also gives us an awful lot of understanding as to how injuries in one part of the body can be transferred to other regions of the body, giving rise to compensation. So if we look at this in terms of function, I want you to try and do something for me if you're all prepared to do that. I know it sounds a little bit silly, but here's Dennis Potvin. And I'm going to try and ask Dennis to touch his nose. And that's exactly what he's doing there. Now, I'd like all of you to try and do this, but make a difference, and that is close your eyes and then try and gently touch your nose. See if you can do that. So it looks as if all of you have succeeded in doing that without poking your neighbor or poking yourself in the eye. This is a relatively simple task in terms of muscle use and physiology. But when we start to break it down, it becomes incredibly complex. What we're looking at, of course, are muscle spindle receptors, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors, Pacini receptors. All three of these working together to help you coordinate that movement that you just performed, touching your nose gently. These muscle spindle receptors are something we're starting to look at using acoustic myography. And we now know that they're much more involved in just, well, the classic explanation for their function is to measure the length of a muscle and send signals back to the central nervous system. But we now know that they're actually involved in deciding and adjusting effort and perception of effort. So there's an awful lot of information that these receptors can provide us with. If we then look at the muscles that you've just used, so this very simple task of touching your nose has actually involved using approximately 15 skeletal muscles. Probably more, in fact, because you'll have used your core muscles to sit in the chair and other muscles to hold your neck and head in place. But you've involved a sort of cerebellar function test, if you like. You've achieved a movement in a coordinated and balanced way. You've also achieved an auditory cognition because you were listening to my signals and my advice as to what to do. I'll come back to those later on in the talk. 15 active muscles. Well, the situation also becomes a little bit more complex because each one of these 15 muscles has been assessed in 3 different ways. Integrated by the motor cortex in terms of its efficiency. You might want to call it coordination or organization or efficiency. And spatial summation. How many fibers should be recruited for the task involved? And then temporal summation. What firing frequency should each of those muscle fibers be fired at? So for each one of these 15 muscles you've just used, these 3 parameters were involved for each muscle. You decided on the coordination or efficiency, spatial and temporal summation, and you've also incorporated balance into what you were doing. This then begins to become a really complex movement, and yet it was relatively simple. In terms of motor cortex and the coordination and activation of muscles, we know that they start up here in the prefrontal cortex for voluntary movement, moving on to the basal nuclei for movement planning, and then on through the thalamus and the cerebellum until we reach the brainstem, where we have a dedicated signal for muscle contraction. And this signal for muscle contraction has 3 distinct components. It has an efficiency component, a spatial, and a temporal component. So every time you use a specific muscle, your motor cortex has decided how that muscle is going to be coordinated and efficiently used. How long are those muscle fibers going to remain active? When are they going to be switched off? Coordination. You've decided exactly how many fibers to activate and what firing frequency at which to run them. And all of this ends up in an extremely complex movement, in this case, a BMX rider. I'll talk a little bit more about those in one of the future slides we'll look at together. Movements then, apparently relatively simple, but extremely complex when you start to pull them apart. Efficiency, spatial summation, temporal summation, and then you've got these receptors that are involved in sending signals back to the brain. Well, I haven't said much about acoustic myography yet. I'll come to that in a minute. This slide shows the sort of skills or techniques that we have at the moment for assessing muscle and muscle performance. Some of them relatively helpful or unhelpful in their analysis of what's going on in muscles. Over to the right-hand side, you'll see surface electromyography and then acoustic myography. So these two techniques seem to be the best in terms of dynamic movement. The other techniques that you see here are mostly associated with static muscle contractions. The individual is not moving, is not doing or performing any specific task. When the muscle starts to work, we talk about a myotatic unit. That's to say, an agonist and an antagonistic muscle working together. We have problems with Parkinson's disease here, where the antagonistic muscles don't always switch off. Again, coordination or efficiency problems. And then we might have homonymous muscles that assist in contractions and movements. Each one of these being directed via a motor nerve, branching out to individual fibers and an end plate that is activated when they're used. If I go back to where I started then with surface electromyography, as a technique, it requires electrodes with electrode gel. Here's a couple of them. The electrodes are then placed on the body of a muscle and taped into place, and then they can be connected up. So here we have an electrode with gel, we have the skin, the epidermis, and the muscle that we're interested in, and then we have an electrical system where we have a reference electrode and two sensing electrodes on the muscle of interest. The electrode position turns out to be extremely important with surface electromyography, and if you've tried using it as a technique, you'll be aware of some of its limitations. Here, for example, is a measurement taken from forearm muscle biceps, two electrodes sensing up towards the tendinous junction, to also measuring down here towards the tendinous junction, and then three electrodes placed across the muscle body itself. And if we look at the top recording, these two electrodes, you find that you get a nice signal. If we place the electrodes towards the center of the muscle, we get a bigger signal in terms of amplitude. And again, if we move down towards the tendinous junction, the signal gets weaker again. So this highlights the fact that with SEMG, you need to know exactly where you're placing the electrodes. Position matters considerably. If we come back to this position, just so happens that these two electrodes are sat exactly on the point of innervation. The left and the right-hand electrodes cancel each other out. A positive and negative signal either side of the point of innervation means that we end up with virtually no EMG signal. Positioning then becomes crucial. There are other issues with it, including the signal itself and interference, and you can read the slide at your leisure, and it lists a whole series of problems. One of the big problems is that when we become active, physically active, we begin to sweat. That affects the electrode gel interface, and we get signal problems and loss of signal and effects from that. We also have electrode cable or lead movement artifacts. They can be got away of or removed, of course, using a wireless system, but they're extremely expensive. So there are a number of issues associated with surface electromyography, and that got me to think maybe there was a different alternative to measuring muscle function. I put this slide in because we're also moving ahead in terms of understanding the mechanics of muscle. We know that nebulin is involved in the arrangement of the actin filaments, acting almost as a ruler. And we know that other proteins like titin are involved in spring-like functions with passive elasticity of muscle. But more recently, we've begun to understand that there are fluid biomechanics associated with these structures. Here's a Z line and another Z line. So this structure between here is the force-generating sarcomere. You can see the M line and the myosin filaments and the thin actin filaments off to the left. Imagine then that this muscle contracts, and the myosin and the actin filaments interact. The two Z lines move closer together and produce force. What happens to the fluid? Well, we now know that the fluid that is bathing these structures is actually displaced, and that the rate with which it's displaced determines the speed of contraction of muscle. The displacement occurs faster in fast fibers than it does in slow, but it opens up a whole new world of understanding fluid biomechanics and hydration in muscle and the performance of muscle as a result of that. So what exactly then is acoustic myography? Well, if we take a relaxed muscle and contract it, the myosin and the actin filaments interact, the Z lines move closer to one another, the muscle shortens. The fluid bathing these structures has to be displaced, and as a result, the bulk of the muscle expands. It broadens out and thickens. And as it does so, it produces pressure waves. Each time this muscle contracts and relaxes, it produces pressure waves in the body. And if those pressure waves reach to the skin, then we can actually detect them as sound waves once they transfer into the medium of air. We don't actually let them do that because we capture them. But imagine a muscle that is contracting at a set frequency, let's say 60 or 70 hertz. So 60 or 70 contractions per second. Those pressure waves can be detected if you have a microphone or some sort of similar device. And there were a number of papers published back in the 70s and 80s that used precisely that sort of equipment. But they were all prone to artifacts because the casing itself picked up sound and pressure waves from ambient noise and people moving around. But the principle is good. Provided you have something sensitive enough to pick up these pressure waves, you have a chance of actually picking up the contractions of a muscle. What we've done, in fact, is to produce a very thin brass sensor with a silver plate on the top and piezo ceramic crystals stacked vertically in between these two. It's a wafer-thin sensor. And when you create something like this, it's very sensitive to pressure waves. The brass plate changes shape and deflects, and as it does so, the crystals are compressed. They produce a very small voltage, and if you have a system that is accurate enough to pick that up, then you can amplify pure muscle contractions. And that's effectively what we've done with acoustic myography. So now it really doesn't matter too much where you place your sensors on your muscle. You're going to end up with a signal that is very similar because the contractions are very similar throughout the muscle body. You will still have problems if you measure at a transition between two muscles. You'll also have problems if you measure a muscle that is relatively deep and that is contracting. Those pressure waves will come through superficial muscles, but there are ways of removing those signals so you can just record from deeper muscle tissue. Now we're actually measuring the contraction of a muscle. Remember, surface electromyography doesn't measure muscle contraction. It measures the electrical processes that get you to contraction. It measures nerves as they depolarize, end plates as they depolarize, muscle fibers as they depolarize. And that's why it's not particularly accurate in terms of measurements of muscle performance, muscle contraction. By using acoustic myography, we actually pick up the contractions that the muscles are generating as they're working. And this list, which you can go through at your leisure, follows those similar to the SEMG signal, but explains the difference and the benefits of using acoustic myography. So now, finally, we have a technique that we can use with physical performance. A subject that is moving around and performing their sport doing exactly what they want to do, you can measure them at leisure and measure them accurately. So you could have a BMX rider, you could have an ice hockey player, football player, you could have somebody running or cycling. Whilst they're actually doing their sport, you can measure what their muscles are doing and performing, and you can begin to analyze those muscles. So if we go back to Dennis Potvin, you can begin to dismantle those muscle activities, split them apart into their efficiency, their spatial summation, and their temporal summation. How coordinated is your athlete at performing the specific task you want them to perform? How many fibers are they using? What firing frequency? In other words, how much energy are they using to achieve that task? Well, we followed some BMX riders as they prepared for the Olympics in South America. And here you see the results of them. Here we're looking at temporal summation, the firing frequency, spatial summation, the number of fibers active, and efficiency, the coordination with which they use these muscles, switching them on when they need to and switching them off when they don't. And you'll notice that the first parameter to improve, the black line here is the baseline, and you'll see within a month they've already improved in terms of their T-score. So temporal summation is one of the first parameters to improve very quickly when you start training someone. The next parameter, here's baseline, shifting up to red and blue and eventually up to yellow over a 10-month period, is spatial summation. So not only temporal summation, but spatial summation. The athletes get more efficient at switching on just the right number of fibers for the task and not too many. And then finally, E, the efficiency score, coordination. That took a little bit longer to improve, but it did improve considerably over the 10-month period. So temporal summation changes first, then spatial summation, and then coordination. And you can follow this for individuals in real time for specific muscle groups. Well, if we go back to Thomas Myers and the myofascial kinetic lines, we also need to think about balance, and with it comes imbalance. The big question really is, what constitutes balance or imbalance? How out of whack does a muscle have to be before you see signs of imbalance? And that still remains an open question. But even the slightest imbalance between the left and the right-hand side, indicated here by this green and white scale. And incidentally, the acoustic myography system shows you this balance in real time. As a subject is moving around in front of you, you can see how they're using their left and their right-hand sides. We know that a slight imbalance leads to compensation. We start to overuse one part of the body, one muscle group, as we protect another part of the body. So balance becomes important. And in this case, the acoustic myography balance score is measured as the E, the S, and the T score for the left-hand side minus the E, the S, and the T score for the right-hand side. So a plus or a minus will tell you whether the left side is working more than the right side of the body. This balance score has the equation that you can see here. And I put this graph together because it shows you how closely correlated the S and the T score are with work, with effort. You can see an increase in load on the x-axis, and you can see this beautiful correlation on the S score and the T score. In fact, if you place these two parameters together, you end up with a parameter that matches very, very closely the actual amount of force produced by a muscle. We call it the ST score. It's an average of spatial and temporal summation. Here's spatial summation, the red dots. Here's temporal summation, the blue dots. And if we take an average, we end up with this beautiful linear correlation, the ST score, that matches really very closely with force production in a muscle. So not only can we see what's going on in a muscle, we can also begin to correlate it with something useful. And down here, the x-axis represents maximum voluntary force. You can see the linear correlation that we have here. We can also use it to follow recovery. This was an individual that damaged their Achilles tendon, and they were asked to perform for 30 seconds of activity, physical activity, on a treadmill. And you can see the periods of activity with a gap of rest in between of just a few seconds. And you can see the intensity or the speed with which the subject was walking or almost running, 3.5, 4.5 kilometers an hour. Notice with the increasing intensity of the change in gait, can you see how the acoustic myography signal increases in amplitude? Why does it do that? Well, of course, with an increase in speed, you need to recruit more fibers. There's also a transition in frequency here, slight shift in frequency towards a higher working frequency to produce the speed needed to move forward. So you can see, very easily correlated with force and speed. This is another case where a subject suffered a cervical disc herniation, and it was repaired by surgery. They ended up losing control and muscle function of their biceps. And so we followed their biceps recovery over a number of days, almost a complete year of retraining. The red dots, they represent the subject simply rotating their arm very slowly, using the biceps as they do. And then the blue squares represent the same muscle activity, but now at a much higher speed, a faster voluntary activity. To begin with, shortly after the operation, you'll see that both the fast and the slow signal amplitude was minimal. There was very little neural signal getting through to the muscle. The muscle had been affected, of course, because the nerve had been temporarily crushed. And as that nerve began to recover, what we could see was an improvement in not only the slow, but also the fast muscle activity. And you can see how the fast muscle improves and the slow muscle also improves with time as the nerve begins to recover and the muscle begins to get action potential signals to fire it again. If you look at the graph carefully, and maybe on your slides later, you'll notice this point has a little star above it. This point also has a little star above it. And at these 2 points, you'll notice that the red and the blue symbols lie on top of one another. In other words, the fast signal has dropped down to the slow signal ability. What was going on here? Well, it turns out that on both these occasions, the subject had simply overtrained. They had overtrained and fatigued their fast fibers, and at this point where we measured them, the fibers were still fatigued. So you can see a difference in training intensity, and you can see how it affects the signal. A nice, sensitive signal. I'm aware that you're working with different athletes than I have been working with for some of the years. I've been working with horses. This is a horse set up with acoustic myography on the back and the neck, and this is me filming what's going on. And you can actually see in real time on a smartphone or a tablet. This is one muscle group, and you can see the left and the right sides and the balance. And this is another muscle group, again, left and right-hand side and the balance. So as the subject is moving around, you can actually see, using acoustic myography, what is going on. This happens to be really useful in terms of the horse and the rider, because we can communicate back to the rider and tell them what they should do instead of what they've been doing previously. So we can correct their riding style, improve their performance with the horse. But we can do exactly the same with somebody that is exercising and training, not necessarily on a horse, but another sports discipline. The signal itself, because it's a sound wave, can really very easily analyzed. Here you can see a typical signal. You can see a period of inactivity, just sort of resting tonus in the muscle. And then you can see somebody walking here, and you can see the individual spikes as the muscle is active during a period of walk, and then they stand still again at the end. Typically, we would pick a recording frame that isolated the start and the end signals, where the muscle begins to get up to speed and then slows down. So we've got a nice consistent working muscle activity. And then we can analyze it very, very quickly in terms of its E score, its S score, and its T score. Its efficiency, the efficiency and coordination level, its amplitude or spatial summation, in other words, how many fibers are active for that specific task, and its firing frequency, temporal summation. So you can very quickly get a detailed insight into how the muscle is working. We have no filtering, and there's no signal adjustment, and the sampling rate is 1,000 bits of data per second. So, a quick summary of what I've just been talking about. We have an acoustic myography system that is detailed in the way it measures muscle performance. Finally, we actually have something that we can use, non-invasive, quick to adapt and quick to use, but accurate in terms of muscle performance. We also have a number of advantages that AMG has over, for example, surface EMG and some of the issues there. And we have a technique that has been proven over the past 15 years with a whole series of publications that show how it can be used and under what circumstances it works beautifully. If we come back to what we were talking about earlier, cerebellar function, tests and movement, and then coordination and balance and auditory cognition, maybe we can also use it in the future for other tests. Well, from time to time, accidents happen. This is my bicycle, and this is the car that knocked me off it 2 weeks ago. You can see the front wheel is pretty badly damaged. It won't rotate anymore. Another shot of it here. Well, of course, what happens, it's a bit like falling off a horse when you fall off a penny farthing. The height is about the same. The risk is that you do some sort of muscular damage, that you get some sort of whiplash. Well, that can be measured and analyzed using acoustic myography. But the other aspect, of course, when you fall and you injure yourself, what about concussion? Can we do something to do with that? And the answer is that we're currently looking into that, but it looks extremely promising. Here's a signal taken from the corner of the eye, and then a series of tests here that can be performed to better understand issues with concussion. So the first line talks about speaking to the subject. So that involves the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe. The second involves asking the subject to blink when they see a specific blue spot on a tablet or a smartphone. So this checks whether the blinking center, the globus pallidus, is working correctly. You could also involve the screen of a smartphone close up to the subject for visual recognition. So this is the ventral occipital lobe and the optic nerve that you're testing. You might also ask the subject to perform a set number of blinks, 5 or 6 or something like that, perhaps even asking them to do it in rapid sequence. And this, of course, tests for the orbitofrontal cortex and the rate with which individuals are able to blink. And then you might ask them to perform rather weak or faint contractions, and then more forceful ones 3 times in a row. Again, testing for cerebellum cortex and forceful blinks and damage to that region of the brain. So something simple like this could be used before you move a subject to start to look at aspects of concussion, and then you can perform it subsequently afterwards as the subject recovers. One of the other things we've been looking at for the future, very close to the heart of Dennis Potvin, is hydration. And we've been looking to see, instead of measuring muscle contraction, what happens if we run a series of frequencies through the muscle itself and then use the acoustic myography system to detect those contractions. So you initiate a set sequence of vibrations and measure how efficient the muscle is at picking those vibrations up. And if you do that in a resting state, this was a fairly fit young individual, you find that they have this sort of frequency profile. So here you'll see that they have an optimal firing frequency, a resonant frequency, somewhere around about 50 to 30 hertz. Higher frequencies, the amplitude is much smaller, and at lower frequencies, it's also much smaller. You can then put them into a sauna, and you begin to see how some of these frequencies are affected by dehydration. But most interestingly, if you rehydrate a subject, notice how these higher end frequencies suddenly gain in amplitude. And that goes back to what we now know about fast fibers being much faster to rehydrate than slower fibers. There's a really nice paper that talks about water deprivation decreases the strength in fast twitch muscles in contrast to slow twitch muscles. It's a study involving rats, but it fits with the biomechanics that we know of muscle and the fact that myosin and actin filaments, when they interact, displace fluid and giving rise to the pressure waves that we pick up as acoustic myography. Now we can use acoustic myography to actually look at the rehydrated status of a muscle, and it occurs very, very quickly. Within a matter of just a few minutes, you've got rehydration of fast twitch muscles. Okay, I realize you need to get on to other lectures, so I'll finish for now, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take one or two before we leave. I think we've got about 5 minutes before the next lecture. Thank you very much for listening and for coming today.